The story, you may have gathered, I want to tell you. It's a story which I think has never been adequately told. It's a story about how the West acquired its distinctive beliefs and institutions, what I shall call liberal secularism, with its underlying goal of working towards the creation of an equal liberty. Is it mere accident that liberal secularism developed in the West? I don't think so. But first, let me explain why I think it's understanding the story about the origins of liberal secularism is especially important today. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the West is in crisis. The advance of China, India, and a number of other countries has had led to a dramatic shift in economic power eastwards. In the political sphere, military adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan have compromised Western influence, leading the United States to at least partially withdraw from its superpower role. But the West's troubles go deeper than that, I think. It is suffering from a moral crisis, a crisis of identity. I mean, many are now uncomfortable about using the term West at all, for fear that it carries the residue of racism and imperialism. But that's not the only source of discomfort. Our crisis of identity also springs from immigration and the challenge of Islam, a creed that can make Western liberal secularism at times seem tepid, if not worse. Indeed, today, I think the term liberal is at risk of becoming a pejorative. In continental Europe, it often connotes little more than selfish market economics. In parts of the United States, it's becoming a synonym for radical, socialist, even immoral. But who are we in the West if not liberal? Elusive though the term may be, at times, this remains the best description of Western attitudes and institutions. Yet, as I said at the start, we lack a convincing story we can tell ourselves about our moral roots. Our self-image comes dangerously close at times to equating liberal secularism with non-belief. A more sophisticated version of that view is that our political and legal systems aim to achieve neutrality. What a contrast with the 19th century, when liberal carried a conviction that it was the condition of human flourishing. As I said, we lack a convincing story. Because in the 19th century, freedom was deemed very often to the freedom for the individual to choose for themselves was understood to be crucial to the moralizing process, helping individuals to assume a moral responsibility for their own choices and giving them an opportunity to work for the common good. The vision of liberalism on offer then was not of an atomized, antisocial, or merely utilitarian order. It had a depth we seem to lack. Today, we can even be embarrassed by a suggestion that we explore that depth. I mean, take, for example, the Convention on the Future of Europe under the chairmanship of Giscard d'Estaing in 1973. When discussing a draft of a prologue to that would-be constitution, describing the moral and intellectual roots of modern Europe, heated arguments developed between those who wanted to refer to its Christian roots as well as to ancient Greece and Rome. Some countries, led by Poland, were strongly in favor, while others, led by France, were strongly opposed. Many countries were simply embarrassed, I think, and out of embarrassment, they wanted the question to go away. So it did. The difficulty we have in telling ourselves a convincing story about our past springs, I think, above all from the categories we conventionally apply to it: the ancient world, the Middle Ages, the modern world. Those categories immediately introduce discontinuity. Since the 18th century, if not before, the centuries between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Renaissance have been portrayed as dominated by superstition, ignorance, social hierarchy, clerical oppression. I mean, 18th century writers like Hume, Voltaire, Edward Gibbon took delight in applying the adjective barbarous to the Middle Ages. They presented altogether the Middle Ages as a period of regression rather than progression, a setback in the story of human progress. Gibbon's famous history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was shaped by his desire to see the development of rational secular order represented by ancient Greece and Rome renewed. Now, understanding the ancient world as secular, because it lacked a Christian church and an oppressive, privileged clergy, at least apparently, became an important political weapon during the early modern struggles to separate church and state in Europe. Enlightenment writers were tempted to portray antiquity as a world of free thinkers and civic virtue. Ancient liberty became something revered, something to be recovered. So Enlightenment writers very often, I think, succumbed to what might be called the great temptation. They were tempted to maximize the moral and intellectual distance between modern Europe and the Middle Ages, and minimize the moral and intellectual distance between modern Europe and the ancient world. That led them, in a sense, to sanitize the ancient world, its beliefs and practices. And the result of succumbing to that, what I call great temptation, is that our conception of modernity, of liberal secularism and its origins, is flawed. For the Enlightenment count, by portraying the ancient world as secular and proto-modern, fails to notice a deep continuity between the Middle Ages and the modern world. So the first thing I do in my book, Inventing the Individuals, is look more closely at the ancient world. What do we find? Well, we find a world that was saturated with inequalities of status and treatment. The fundamental unit of the social world in Greece and Rome, the basic constituent of the city-state, was the patriarchal family rather than the individual. That is, society was understood as an association of families rather than of individuals. And each ancient family was itself a kind of church. For the head of the family, the paterfamilias, was not just the chief magistrate of the family, he was also its high priest. The ancient family was a cult devoted to ancestor worship. I try to make vivid this moral distance between us and the world of the ancient family by giving an account of what still survives and seems an innocuous practice. That is, the practice of carrying a bride over the threshold of her new husband's house. And if you read about the ancient family, you discover the origins of this practice, which was that a young girl about to marry into another family had to be separated, first of all, in a formal ceremony before the family altar from the family cult. And thereby, she lost her identity. She became a non-person, in effect. And in order to enter her husband's house, she had to be carried over the threshold as someone who was a non-person. And only when she was initiated in the cult of her husband's family did she become a person again. I mean, I think it begins perhaps to suggest the depth of moral distance between those worlds. We cannot, I think, understand the ancient world unless if we fail to notice that the distinction we make between the public and the private spheres is not the distinction they made. Their distinction was between the public and the domestic spheres, and the domestic sphere was a sphere of radical inequality. Little wonder, therefore, that the assumption which dominated ancient thinking, ran through all of its forms, really, was the assumption of natural inequality. This emerged in civic life, where citizens were a privileged caste. Citizenship was a badge of inequality. Citizens were what Nietzsche would later call supermen. The public sphere was their playground, and women were hardly more than mere chattels. Though restricted in later antiquity, the paterfamilias originally had the power of life and death over his family members as well as his slaves. The paterfamilias was a god in preparation, who would in due course find his place among the family divinities. So in holding up the ancient world as an inspiration for a world free of religious oppression, thinkers of enlightenment looked in the wrong place for religion. They failed to notice that the ancient family was itself a kind of church. Nor did they notice that the assumption of natural inequality, of radical status differences, permeated the meaning of rationality itself. I mean, not only were the privileges of citizens scarcely contested, hierarchy was seen everywhere, even in the natural world. When looking at the heavens, the ancients assumed the earth was surrounded by crystalline spheres, each purer the further removed it was from the mere matter of the earth. Nature was understood as an order in which everything had its proper appointed place in a hierarchy of being. So what put an end to the dominance of this assumption of natural inequality? No doubt there were many contributing causes, especially the decline of the city-state and the spread of Roman power around the Mediterranean. But the decisive change in belief, I think, came with the early Christian movement. Under Pauline influence especially, Christian belief in the equality of souls in the eyes of God transformed the meaning of society and undercut traditional inequalities of status. What Pauline beliefs brought about was a moral revolution, a revolution which would provide the basis for a social revolution, eventually. For these new beliefs threatened previous views of the proper basis of human association. That is, they overturned the claims of the family, tribe, or caste. So how do we go about understanding this process of transformation? Well, I suggest tonight we might consider it as taking place in 3 stages. The first could be called the foundation, that is, the moral revolution itself. The second stage was a long period of subversion, the undercutting of traditional inequalities of status from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to, say, the millennium year 1000. While the third was the period that could be called construction, the 11th to the 15th century, from which the modern world emerged. So let's look briefly at each. First, the foundation, a moral revolution. Christianity, which I think is an extraordinary mixture of Judaism and Greek philosophy, joined Jewish emphasis on God's will with the abstracting potential of philosophy, by extending a God-given moral status to all of humanity, the fatherhood of God entailing the brotherhood of man. Thus, the Christian God was not so much a distant and remote other like Yahweh, but a God to be found within each of us. And that belief in an underlying moral equality of status led in turn to a quite new emphasis on human freedom and human agency, at the will. I mean, early fathers of the church, such as Origen, who was trained in Greek philosophy, saw Christian liberty as the heart of the new faith, contrasting it with Judaism's emphasis on rules, that is, on the law. Tertullian, writing near the end of the 2nd century AD, was even more emphatic. And I'm going to read you just a few, not too many, I promise you, a few quotations from some of these early writers. And I think you may notice, as I certainly noticed, how close some of their idiom is to the idiom we associate with the Enlightenment and the 18th century. Here's Tertullian writing AD 190, maybe 200. One mighty deed alone was sufficient for our God to bring freedom to the human person. We worship the one God. There are others whom you regard, he's talking to pagans, regard as gods. We know them as demons. Nevertheless, it is a basic human right that everyone should be free to worship according to his own convictions. Religion must be practiced freely, not by coercion. This is AD circa 200. So what emerges from some of these the writings of the early fathers is an ideal not so far removed from an ideal of an equal liberty, opening the way, on their assumptions, of course, to a fully moralized outcome, an outcome which they often described, drawing on Paul, as the body of Christ. And 2 centuries later, Augustine was still wrestling with the implications of free will and the remarkable capacity, as he so subtly described it, for the way in which we trap ourselves in bad habits and frustrate our own freedom of the will. Now, that early insistence and emphasis on freedom of the will suggested a new basis for association, voluntary association. And it was not long before a popular movement within Christianity began to act on that implication. The monastic movement, as it organized itself, based law and obedience not on unthinking custom or external force, which had been the traditional grounds of association, but on individual consent and the role of conscience. Thus, the individual began to displace the family, tribe, or caste as the basis of social organization. This monastic movement also began to rehabilitate work, rescuing it from its ancient association with a servile status. And while the early church did not directly challenge the institution of slavery, it did make the freeing of slaves an important virtue. I mean, in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa in Constantinople delivered a powerful sermon saying that selling any human or buying any human was an attack on the image of God. The impact of Christianity had thus begun to change moral institutions even before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But it would be a mistake to suppose that laying the foundation of a moral revolution could lead suddenly to a social revolution. Social attitudes and habits are too deep-seated and too recalcitrant for anything to change that rapidly. It would be centuries before many implications of the new assumption of moral equality could be drawn out and understood. So the second period I have called the process of subversion. I can only give you glimpses of this almost agonizingly slow process. If we were to look for a physical analogy, it would be with the way a constant dripping of water can, over millennia, create a channel through a rock formation, changing its shape altogether. Still, I'll try to give you a few examples of striking changes in moral attitudes in the centuries between the fall of the Western Empire and the year 1000. And you may, again, perhaps notice that they don't fit easily into the standard stereotypical view of the Dark or Middle Ages. Amid the chaotic conditions resulting from the Germanic invasions and fall of the Western Empire, the Church was terrified about its own survival. It sought a sword of its own and found what can be described as a moral sword, proclaiming that it had access to another world, offering salvation to souls. The care of souls was its domain, a sacred rather than secular domain. Spiritual power was one thing, secular power another. In the later 6th century, the writings of Pope Gregory the Great, which were widely diffused, created a powerful new rhetoric, the care of souls. And this rhetoric had a radical individualizing potential, I think. Gregory's writings encouraged both rulers and subjects to understand themselves finally in a new way, for it focused on the fate of souls. This new rhetoric and the presence of a Christian clergy had in turn a powerful effect. That effect was nothing less than the undermining and eventual destruction of paterfamilias, of the patriarchal family. The clergy provided daughters and younger sons with an external court of appeal, moral support unavailable to family members in the ancient world. Let me give just one example of the consequences. Chilperic, the king of the Franks from 561 to 584, which was not much more than a generation after the conversion of the Franks, proclaimed shortly before his death, and I quote, "A long-standing and wicked custom of our people denies sisters a share with their brothers in their father's land. But I consider this wrong, since my children came equally from God. Therefore, my dearest daughter, I make you an equal and legitimate heir with your brothers, my sons." In the following 2 centuries, the ceremony of Mass ceased to be a kind of family offering and became an acutely individualized affair between the soul and God. At its extreme, it could foster a virtual terror about salvation, the fate of the soul after death, something dramatized in wall paintings in churches, wall paintings of the Last Judgment. Slowly, not very coherently, the immortal family was giving way to the immortal individual soul. Now, I think the Carolingian period saw this new individualized self-understanding begin to change and impact on the focus of government. A concern for free will and the quality of individual intentions emerged. When Charlemagne, Charles the Great, at the end of a long campaign, boasted that he had forcibly converted thousands of his Saxon prisoners, his advisor and friend, Alcuin, a Northumberland monk whom he had invited to his court, protested. He argued that men can be coerced into baptism, but not into faith. And I quote Alcuin here: "Faith must be voluntary, not coerced. Converts must be drawn to the faith, not coerced. A person can be compelled to be baptized, yet not believe. An adult convert should answer what he truly believes and feels, and if he lies, he will not have true salvation." So enforced belief, Alcuin implied, is a contradiction in terms. Did rulers learn? Well, I think Charlemagne did. And this was the case with Charlemagne, and it throws light on remarkable features of his later reign. The ancient idea of lordship or dominion, that is, of a hereditary obligation to an intrinsic superior, no longer seemed by itself an adequate basis for governing in the face of these intuitions about the care of souls. So while continuing to affirm the importance of lordship, Charlemagne introduced something utterly new. In a series of decrees, he asked for oaths of allegiance to be sworn, first of all, by all men. But a few years later, he extended the oath to, and I quote, "absolutely everyone, that is, to women and even to slaves." That would have been unthinkable in the ancient world. And it is tempting to see Charlemagne's desire to root his authority in individual wills, to supplement the claims of ancient lordship, as a precarious first movement towards a belief in government by consent. In the 10th century, the dissolution of the Carolingian Empire and emergence of what would be called feudalism, with the radical localizing of power, created a threat to the identity of the Christian Church, to its existence, even as a body, distinct body in society. For the owners of fiefs increasingly saw churches as their property and priests as their servants. How was the church to defend itself? The idea of centralized government, which was disappearing from the secular sphere with the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, was revived within the church by a monastic movement led by the Abbey of Cluny. Cluny took the lead in organizing a reaction to the fearful disorders which had accompanied the localizing of power, organizing public meetings which saw the people who had always been offstage suddenly coming on stage, historically, in protest movements, which led to the so-called peace of God, an agreement asserting the moral claims of everyone to security. Those claims took little notice of feudal status differences. The care of souls was once again proving to be subversive of a corporate conception of society. A new self-respect can be detected in protests at this period. And here I'd like to read. This is a chronicle about a peasant uprising in Normandy in the late 10th century, 987 to be exact. This is the account, and I quote, "In all the various regions of Normandy, of the Norman land, the peasantry assembled in numerous bodies and unanimously resolved to live henceforth according to their own wills, declaring that, despising what the established law had laid down touching the share of wood and water to be enjoyed by the people, they would govern themselves by their own laws, and enact and confirm these. Each troop of these persons elected 2 deputies, who were all to assemble at a certain place in the center of the country, and there to pass these laws." Now, there's a self-respect lurking in that account of the actions of the peasantry, which I think, again, would be completely foreign to, say, slave revolts in the ancient world. Completely foreign to it. With the 11th century, we reach the third period, which I've called construction. For during this century, Cluny's centralizing impetus invaded Rome and the papacy. Determined and able monastic reformers became advisors to popes and eventually popes themselves. And with them, a new ambition developed in the papacy. If the church was to defend itself, it needed its own legal system and courts. And so in the 12th and 13th century, the papacy oversaw the creation of a system of canon law, drawing on Roman law, but adapting it to Christian beliefs. That creation of a systematic canon law would, I think, prove decisive for the development of the West. Why? First, the basic unit of subjection in canon law was the soul, that is, the individual, not the family, tribe, or caste. Second, by delimiting its own sacred sphere of action, the Church created a residual secular sphere concerned with public order and the protection of property. Sacred and secular spheres thus became far more clearly demarcated. But the third innovation resulting from the work of canon lawyers would later, I think, prove decisive for the development of what we know as liberalism. Canonists converted the theory of natural law into a theory of natural rights. Rights inhering individuals because of their intrinsic moral status and power. Whereas ancient natural law had rested on the assumption of natural inequality, everything in its place. Natural rights rested on the assumption of moral equality and reciprocity, relying, in effect, on the golden rule to provide the foundation for a new sense of justice. Canonists steadily expanded the sphere of natural rights, leading to increasing numbers of relationships being understood in terms of choice and obligation that were self-assumed. These individualizing developments soon had consequences in the secular sphere, I think. For secular rulers were not slow to see the opportunities offered by these developments, the chance they offered kings to govern their subjects directly as individuals, rather than through intermediaries such as feudal overlords and the paterfamilias. It spelled, in a sense, the end of feudal monarchy and a transition to the sovereign right, which would be claimed by the nation-state. That is, the right to rule individuals. The self-interest of monarchs and the new sense of justice fostered by the idea of natural rights were fused. In 1315, the new King of France, Louis le Hutin, issued a most remarkable proclamation. And I want to read that because, again, the similarity to the language of the Enlightenment, I think, is remarkable. This is 1315. Louis, by the grace of God, King of France and Navarre, as according to the law of nature, each must be born free, and that by some usages and customs, which of great antiquity have been introduced and hitherto preserved in our kingdom, many common people have fallen into servitude and diverse conditions which very much displease us. We, considering that our kingdom is called the kingdom of the Franks, that is, free men, and wishing that the fact should be fully accordant with the name, upon declaration of our great council, have ordered generally throughout our kingdom such servitudes be brought back to freedom, and that to all those who had from origin or recently from marriage or from residence in places of servile condition are fallen into bonds of servitude, freedom be given. 1315. As I said, notice how close his language is to the language we associate with the 18th century Enlightenment. But you may say these later events were associated with claims not only for individual or civil rights, but for the goal of self-government. Well, stimulated by developments in canon law, self-government became a major preoccupation within the Church by the 14th century. There were widespread fears that the centralizing of final legal authority in the papacy, its sovereignty, had led to an excessive concentration of power in Rome. In reaction, canon laws took a fascinating step. They redefined the meaning of a corporate body. Instead of corporate bodies being created always and necessarily by a superior authority, lordship, dominion, which bestowed privileges and duties on members, instead, for the canons, any group of persons organizing themselves in pursuit of a common aim could possess the privileges and liberties of a corporation. The canon's lawyers assumed that final authority flowed upwards rather than from the top downwards, a move we might describe as from aristocracy to democracy. Corporate bodies were no longer owned by their superiors, but rather served their members. Such, after all, had been the development of the universities, creating a sphere of intellectual freedom not subject entirely either to church or to state. And that was, I think, the intellectual background to the conciliar movement, which developed towards the end of the 14th century in response to schism in the church caused by first 2 and 3 rival popes competing for primacy. The conciliarists were reformers who, drawing on the achievements of canon lawyers, sought to create something like representative government in the church. In their view, the final authority of the church was and had always been the community of the faithful, that is, Ecclesia Christiani, speaking through a general council. The conciliar movement, of course, failed in the 15th century, but in failing, it helped to usher in the Reformation and its aftermath. So altogether, the 14th and 15th centuries, I think, are a decisive moment in the story of the origins of liberal secularism. The period when, and this is the centerpiece of my argument, really, when the moral intuitions generated by Christianity began to be turned against the claims and behavior of the church itself. Christianity had, in a sense, generated its own antibody in the form of liberal secularism. In philosophical terms, liberal secularism would separate Christian ontology from the metaphysics of salvation. And so my argument overall is that Christian moral intuitions played a pivotal role in shaping the discourse which gave rise to modern liberalism and secularism. Indeed, the pattern through which liberalism and secularism developed from the 16th to the 18th century resembles nothing so much as the stages through which canon law developed from the 12th to the 15th century. First, Hobbes' insistence on human equality, then Locke's invoking natural rights, and finally, Rousseau's call for self-government. The sequence of argument is extraordinarily similar. The canonists, so to speak, got there first. There are important differences, of course, between the earlier and later periods. Although the roots of liberalism were established in the 14th and early 15th century, they remained dispersed. They hadn't yet been combined to create a coherent program for reform. They hadn't been turned into a doctrine or ideology. That happened only after the Reformation, and subsequent religious wars created a powerful reaction, a determination to protect social peace from conflicts of religious belief. So, my argument is that liberal secularism is the unintended consequence of the moral intuitions generated by Christianity. That is why in my book I try to emphasize the point by saying that liberal secularism should be considered not the legitimate child of Christianity, but its natural child, conceived out of wedlock. It was certainly not something the Church has struggled to create, far from it. The Catholic Church and even the new Protestant churches long struggled against it. Nevertheless, I think liberal secularism emerged when the moral intuitions generated by Christianity were turned against attempts by churches relying on state power to coerce belief. For leading Christian thinkers had long since argued that coerced belief is a contradiction in terms. Well, when I was invited to give this lecture, I said I could, if I wanted to, also draw in an earlier book I wrote called Democracy in Europe. So I'm going to try, without too much artifice, to do that very briefly. What conclusions can we draw from this story when applied to the contemporary world? Well, the first, I think, is the futility of thinking and talking in terms of a war between religion and secularism, a struggle which can plausibly be called a civil war because of the moral roots shared by the two sides. Why do Europeans still feel happier referring to the role of ancient Greece and Rome than to the church in the formation of their culture? By continuing this civil war, each side loses, I think. The churches run the risk of appearing irrelevant to the contemporary world, a mere throwback, while secularists run the risk of appearing to have no deep moral roots, of at best endorsing neutrality between different beliefs, or at worst, representing non-belief. And the visceral reaction of the French left to the prospect of acknowledging the Christian roots of Europe in Giscard's convention has its counterpart in much church rhetoric deploring the growth of godless secularism. Even Benedict XVI, the most learned pope, was not free of this habit. He called for an alliance between religions in order to combat secularism. I think we must leave behind any mindset which identifies secularism with indifference and non-belief. Ronald Dworkin, a well-known American jurisprudence professor, defines secularism as neutrality between conceptions of the good life. That seems to me wrong, because it misses the way in which liberal secularism partly constitutes a conception of the good life. Its commitment to an equal liberty entails respect for the autonomy of others, an autonomy protected by recognizing their equal fundamental rights. That brings me to a second reflection about contemporary politics. It seems to me that we are in danger of weakening the idea of fundamental rights by inflating the language of rights, extending the concept to too many claims which reflect contentious contemporary policy issues rather than fundamental issues. The idea of natural rights put forward by canonists and taken up by the Enlightenment became an important ingredient of liberal constitutional thought, as you know. Framed in bills of rights, it served to protect life, conscience, liberty, and property. It is no accident that such bills were originally rather short, for the rights they enshrined were meant to be fundamental. They were principles that pointed in a direction, but not rules that could be applied mechanically. But recently there has been a temptation to expand the number of rights in such charters, and I'm afraid the recent European Charter of Rights is an example of that inflation of the language of basic rights. I say cynically, it's almost as if the French were seeking to protect their social model by incorporating many of its features in a Declaration of Basic Rights. Are holidays, working hours, and the enjoyment of family life suitable for such direct declarations? I must say I doubt it, for they blur the distinction between current wants or preferences and fundamental rights. And the result is that the very idea of a fundamental right loses its purchase. This leads me to a third point. There's a tendency in contemporary political thought, especially, I may say, in the Anglo-American world, for liberalism to collapse into utilitarianism. Partly this is due to the influence and impact of economic theory, where utilitarianism, maximizing the satisfaction of preferences, looms so large in constituting the subject itself. But arguably, this slide of liberalism towards utilitarianism threatens both the liberal idea of justice and the autonomy it encourages. The maximizing of satisfactions or happiness does not itself include an adequate restraint on the majority principle. But not only that, Jeremy Bentham's famous maxim, "Pushpin is as good as poetry," circumscribes the goal of autonomy by apparently ruling out serious consideration of the quality of personal intentions. Civic spirit, real involvement in representative government, suffers from this market-based model of society and its needs. It contributes to a criticism of liberalism as underwriting a retreat into a private sector of self-gratification, into the company of family and friends at the expense of the duties of citizenship. It neglects the moralizing potential of political participation and weakens the effectiveness of representative government. Casting citizens as mere consumers has weakened that system everywhere in the West. But I think the threat, in a way, is especially acute in Europe at the moment. And if I can... Oh dear, it's rather late. Perhaps I'd better stop. I was going to make one last point, which is just something I've written about quite a lot, that it seems to me Europe, that one of the unintended consequences of European integration is threatening to create a crisis of representative government as such across Europe. And that is what has always seemed to me the premature decision to have a directly elected European Parliament. The original model of indirect election from national parliaments was, I think, a better model because it connected national parliamentary classes to the European project. That connection, it seems to me, was broken by the decision so early to go for direct election to a European Parliament. And what has the result been? Well, it seems to me the result has been we're now in a situation where the European Parliament, which has steadily increased powers, hasn't any real popular authority. On the other hand, national parliaments, which retain residual popular authority, have less and less power. And in the face of that dilemma, I think people in the street, voters, can ask themselves, who governs me? And uncertainty about the answer to that question is the seedbed of populism. I'll finish on that note.
Thank you so much for this inspiring speech. And I think the audience will take part in a discussion about this speech. And that's the time now. So there's a micro. Please go to that micro if you have a question. Tell your name.
Hello, my name is Maarten Dirksen. Thank you very much for your speech. I think it's easy to agree with you that the early history, or the history of ancient Europe and the early history of the Church has been overly demonized by the Enlightenment movement. However, in that same early history of the Church, there are many examples of acts and thought and doctrines that are antithetical to modern liberalism as you define it. Once they became a majority, Christians quickly started banning heresies, etc., etc. So, given that there's two sides to that story as well, haven't you sanitized the history of the early Church just like the Enlightenment fundamentalists have sanitized the history of ancient Europe?
Up to a point, yes. Why not? The argument is meant to be a corrective, and I'm certainly not saying that there's an unblemished trend or career of the Church that I'm inspecting, but I'm picking out elements which seem to me, to gradually increase in importance. Now, what I think many church historians would agree was that once the Church was recognized by the Roman Empire and then, in effect, adopted by the Roman Empire, all sorts of practices and ideas which hadn't loomed so large in the earlier centuries became only too widespread. And the Church acquired some very bad habits. I entirely agree. But I'm trying to correct a pretty widespread view.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Willem Scholten. My question is, if the Enlightenment philosophers created such a strong distinction between basically good antiquity and the bad Middle Ages, why did they do so? Was it instrumental in their, in a struggle against basically secular power in Europe in the 18th century, or was it more?
I think it was certainly because it was a very useful weapon in the struggle to separate church and state and to remove a privileged position for the church in society, and struggle against what they deemed rightly to be frequent abuses of power by the church, directly and indirectly.
Who wants to? Who has a question? Yeah. Yeah, here. Willem.
Oh, okay. Willem van Ekelen. Thank you very much for your speech, but also I must say I'm a bit puzzled. To me, the beginning and the foundation of enlightenment was cogito ergo sum. Is there any idea in the Middle Ages that anybody would have said that? And secondly, would there have been any chance for him to say that? at a time when books were not yet printed, at a time that there was very little communication except for some minstrels going from one place to the other and maybe having a little fun. But in a completely different society, can you really translate these very laudable aspects which you are underlining? And I think when I look at the Netherlands, we still think, but we are rethinking that now after your speech, that the Middle Ages were really dark ages. And that only when feudalism ended, and that ended to a certain extent because the cities were rising and because we had to fight the water together, and everybody as an individual had a certain role to play. I think those material, but I'm not a Marxist, those material conditions really were more of a determinant in this notion of freedom and recognition of the value of the individual.
I think you underestimate how much de facto freedom of thought there was, especially in the later Middle Ages. I mean, the philosophical movement known as nominalism, whose leading philosopher was William of Ockham, took very, very radical positions on a series of questions ranging from epistemology to moral philosophy. And I mean, Ockham was penalized by the papacy and eventually excommunicated. But nominalism, let me just give one example. The nominalists were the first really to seriously criticize Aristotle and Aristotelian physics. And the nominalists laid the foundation for the transition from Aristotelian physics to modern physics. I mean, Ockham's account of what an explanation, what an empirical explanation involves, is very close to that given by David Hume in the 18th century. I mean, I think we don't realize just how much doctrinal dissent there was in the Middle Ages. Church councils, even in a much, much earlier period, in the really what I call the Dark Ages. I mean, in 6th, 7th, and 8th century Gaul, there were scores of church councils, and they were debating what were semi or quasi philosophical issues about human agency, about it's so easy to lose sight of it, to lose sight of all that, I think, and later the growth of the universities. I mean, which were tolerated in this space which had grown up between church and state, and that, after all, goes back to the late 12th, early 13th century.
More questions?
Dat is ook goed. Loopt u maar om.
No.
Patrick van Schie, we know each other. I have two questions, if I may. One question is, your argument is, you say to liberals, don't forget your Christian roots, in a sense. But isn't your book also about Christian thinkers or Christian democratic thinkers? Don't forget that you are more individualistic than you realize, and all those more communitarian thoughts are really a debasement from the real Christendom, Christianity. My second question is, in the book you also describe the changing function of rationality as something more metaphysical in the antique world and something more individualized later on. Could you say that all those political strivings that want something, that see, as to say, an end in history, in the anti-Popperian sense, are a kind of pre-modern thinking, relating, for example, to the thinking of some politicians that there should be European integration regardless of what citizens would voluntarily choose. Could you classify this as a pre-modern thought?
Yeah, well, yes, I think the communitarian, Michael Sandel, and the communitarian critique of liberalism has never impressed me very much, to be honest. It simply isn't careful enough about the grounds of association, whether it's habit, enforced association, or voluntary association. And it seems to me the most distinctive thing about the liberal tradition is the insistence on voluntary association as the standard. I'm not sure I want to enter into the polemics about Europe. No, I think I won't.
More questions?
My name is Maurice de Graaf. You were talking about universities as quite important. You were talking about universities as being quite important, but as far as I know, the first universities came from the Muslim world. So how do you view the Muslim world as being part for the liberal thoughts during the development of the Enlightenment?
I'm not sure that what in the Middle Ages was called a university really existed in the Muslim world. Universities existed as a corporation, and as a number of medieval historians have pointed out, one of the differences between cities as they developed in the Christian West in the Middle Ages, from the 10th and 11th century on, was that they very early adopted charters and they had a corporate status. Cities in the Muslim world never had any formal status at all as cities, as corporations. And I think that the places of learning, Muslim places of learning, to describe them as universities may be lending a term which is misleading. That's a hunch. I'm no expert on the history of Islam in that respect, but that's my hunch. And the question of course, the recovery of Aristotle and quite a lot of Greek philosophy through translations from the Arabic, which were then translated again mostly by Jewish scholars in Spain, I think. Various things have turned up. One is recent evidence that there was much more of Aristotle known than we had previously supposed before the 12th and 13th century. And a lot of the original translations into Arabic of Greek philosophical texts were actually done by Christian Syrians in the 6th and 7th and 8th century, which also throws interesting light on that very complicated story of transmission.
I already was waiting for a question of Frits Bolkestein, and here he is. Can somebody give him the micro?
First of all, thank you very much indeed, sir, for a most interesting talk. My question pertains to more modern times. According to some people, Europeans have lost confidence in their own civilization. And I think that you alluded to that in your talk. The question is, if that is true, what might be the reason, the cause of that loss of confidence? According to some people, it has to do with the history, in particular, of the first half of the 20th century. In particular, with First World War, the rise of collectivist ideologies, communism, National Socialism, the Second World War, the Holocaust, the intellectual confusion in 1968, Stalinism, and so on. In other words, these people look to a historical explanation for what they see as a loss of confidence of Europeans in their own civilization. Other people recognize that, but believe that there is a role that Christianity has played in this, since Christianity in the Passion according to St. Matthew enjoins us that whoever, I don't know what the English term is, what I mean to say is that whoever heightens himself shall be abased, and whoever abased himself shall be increased in stature. I don't know what the English term is. My knowledge of the English Bible, the authorized version, is not as good as it used to be. And also, of course, these people refer to the Sermon on the Mount with the turn the other cheek and go the second mile. And here I'm sure that it's the correct rendering in English. So there are two avenues which lead to a possible answer to the question why why Europeans have lost self-confidence. There's a historical one and there's the Christian one. I wonder perhaps that you might add a bit of wisdom to this intriguing and, I should think, rather important problem.
It is an important problem, and I think about it and worry about it. Can I say something a bit simplistic to start? As a university teacher, even though retired, what I think is striking about the young now is how little historical knowledge they have. I don't know whether it's as bad. I don't know whether it's as bad everywhere in Europe, but certainly if the United Kingdom and the United States are anything to go by, compared to students 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the knowledge of history is so patchy, and they've very, very often been taught, and here I'm thinking particularly of the United Kingdom, history in tranches. They had a few topics, such as fascism or the English Revolution, but in between they know almost nothing. And if history isn't about sequence, I don't know what it is about. And I think, let's take the case of nation states. I mean, an important part of the emergence and strengthening of nation states was having a story you could tell yourself about, the origins and vicissitudes which have shaped national identity. And I don't think the young have these stories to tell themselves now, to nearly the extent that we did. So I think that absence of a narrative it's by no means the sole determinant, but it has accentuated a kind of crisis. And I'd be interested in your reaction to what I said about liberalism sloping or sliding into utilitarianism, because I do think that that a purely market-oriented view of the world has strengths and limitations too. And if you've been brought up on a kind of solely on a free market basis, it's rather limiting.
You know him.
I do.
You put a question to me, and I am duty-bound to answer it. And I agree with you that liberalism should not be pared down to utilitarianism. Liberalism is a great deal more. It infuses a certain view of the state and of the world, a Weltanschauung, which goes much further than a purely market-oriented approach. But you haven't really answered my question. I'm not going to let you get away with it. The question is it true that Europeans at this time, in this day and age, have lost confidence in their own civilization? And when you refer to the discussion that took place about the preamble of the so-called European Constitution, you alluded to that, Poles being for, French being against. Do you indeed think that that is the case? A loss of confidence. And if you do think so, as I do, then what might be the cause?
Well, I do think so, but I think it's not geographically uniform. And my impression is that, strangely enough, having survived decades of rule from Russia and under the spell, if you like, of Marxism, my impression of students from Eastern Europe is that they have a stronger sense of European civilization than Western European students often do. I mean, Poles leading the way, and that stands out against. I mean, I wonder whether I'm trying to think whether it applies as much to the United States as it does, because I agree with you about Europe, basically, about this loss of confidence. I'm not sure that it applies to quite the same extent to the United States, where there's still quite a strong national narrative. Maybe this should be counted as one of the unintended consequences of integration. I mean, a kind of moral confusion when you, in a way, I pointed to that a little bit with saying that this uncertainty about who rules us, and as between Brussels and the European Parliament or national parliaments.
But you would not agree with Nietzsche that from the quotes that I just uttered about the Bible, and in particular St. Matthew, that leads us to believe that Christianity is a religion of slaves.
What, that it... well, I can't buy that from Nietzsche, really. The qualities required for leadership would be very different on a Nietzschean account on the one hand and what I would see as a liberal Christian-based account on the other. the mere pleasure of leadership and swagger. I mean, many of the things which Nietzsche certainly admired in the ancient world, a kind of shame culture, really, that he falls back on in holding up the heroic Superman. I think that I don't see that Christian morality can be held, can be defended quite properly against that. Christian heresies certainly included Marxism, didn't they? And you could say, I can see an argument that Christianity has spawned heresies which jeopardize some kinds of leadership, but I'm not sure I regret those kinds of leadership being jeopardized.
Thank you.
One more question.
Hi, my name is Merlin Major. I have something to add to this story. There is a political cause, perhaps, for the modern crisis of the EU citizenship or the lack of confidence. There was the religious, but perhaps there's also, which connects to your story, an intellectual problem. And I was wondering whether you have any thoughts in regard of this issue, which is that in moral philosophy nowadays, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, it is much more easy, or it's much more established to have a view which is, in a sense, non-cognitivist, or denies the existence of moral truths or beliefs as being rendering moral truths or facts. So it's become much more intellectually virtuous to claim that you're a non-cognitivist, especially if you're in Oxford or Cambridge, than it was, say, 100 years ago. So I was wondering whether, next to the influences Fritz Bolkestein has mentioned, there's also an intellectual decline in a defense of a moral liberalism, and if that's a problem for present-day liberalism.
Yeah, well, it's the decline of that moral dimension, of that depth of liberalism that, that persuaded me to try to write this book. And the relativist position you're identifying has or had become very common and dominant, even in the philosophical and one might even say more generally the academic world, I think. I wonder if things aren't changing already. I mean, I have the impression, talking to young friends, that, there's of course a great deal to be said for prosperity, but there's also perhaps something to be said for relative deprivation at times. And I think the recent economic and financial crisis, which continues, in fact, maybe turning minds in a more serious direction. And I really do have that impression in talking to some younger people, that, perhaps because they can't look forward to lifetime jobs and a well-defined set of options or channels for their careers, they're thinking more. I hope that's the case.